Let's talk about strip piecing. Strip piecing is an easier way to make checkered patterns like this or nine patches like these without having to mess with all those fiddly little squares. My name is Holly and Knight of String and Story, and it's my job to guide you to quilt with confidence. And today I want to give you some tips and tricks for how to piece with big long strips without getting warping, waving, wobbling, or other distortions that can affect your finished quilt. Now, this is my lumberjane pattern, and in spite of its apparent complexity, lumberjane is made up of a lot of strip piecing. And what that means is that instead of using individual squares to make these parts of the design, we actually piece strips of fabric together and then cut across so that you get like rectangles of squares, and then you can piece those together to make the alternating design. The same thing works here for a nine patch, that we can piece three strips, the teal, the white, the teal, and then cut them across, piece another set, the white, the pink, and the white, and cut across, and then piece yet another set of that teal, white, and teal, and then put those subcut sections together to make this block. I'm going to show you how this works, and I'm going to show you how to keep those strips from warping and wobbling as we get going. Accurate strip piecing actually begins before you sew a single stitch. It's going to start with your cutting process. Now, I mentioned that we want to make sure we prevent any warps or wobbles or wiggles in our strip sets. And as we put big long pieces of fabric like this with other big long pieces of fabric, it likes to stretch, right? There's a lot of length along here that fabric can pull and become warped. And as a result, it can cause the strip sets to bubble and bow or even become distorted so they look like they're curving or shifting to one side. And we want to make sure that we prevent that with some simple steps. Strip piecing is not hard, it just requires a little bit of care. And the first place that we can have care is as we're cutting. When we go to cut strips like these off of our yardage, we want to consider two key things. The first is that we want to pay attention to the grain of the fabric. Now, grain is the threads that make up your fabric. You have the warp and the weft, and they go across each other and weave together. We want to make sure that we are cutting as parallel to the grain of that fabric as we can. If the grain of our fabric is lopsided and then we cut, we end up with an edge that is even stretchier and fabric that is even more likely to warp. So when you go to position your fabric under the ruler, take a moment to look at those threads and make sure they're running parallel to where you're going to be cutting. And then if you are folding your fabric a couple of times to make it fit under a ruler, etc., that you're going fold to selvage, keeping that warp and weft going smoothly across and not crisscrossing, turning, warping at any point. That might mean that the raw edge of your fabric is uneven. We can always square that off as we get started to then make straight cuts from that point forward. That's what squaring off means when used in this step of the cutting process, is that we're getting the fabric so that we can make on grain cuts that are going to run nice and straight instead of having fabric that is quietly warped and is going to end up funky later when we start piecing. The second thing I want you to think about is I want you to think about the tools you use for cutting. Make sure you have a nice sharp rotary blade. And if you're going to be cutting more than a couple of strips, it is well worth investing in a Stripology ruler. This is the Stripology XL. And as you can see, it has these little slits in the ruler at 1/2 inch intervals. So I can lay a piece of fabric underneath and cut multiple strips without moving the ruler or the fabric. This is really helpful because every time you shift your ruler or your fabric, you run the risk of getting that fabric off grain or of the ruler slipping. You're gonna have a lot less slipping with a ruler like the Stripology XL and a lot less chance for things to get warped or uneven. If you start with clean, well-measured on grain cuts, everything else going forward becomes a whole lot easier. Next, you want to consider the piecing itself. Now, it is a whole lot of fun to take big long strips like this and line them up and zhooing underneath that machine at top speed. However, if we were to do that, right, if I were to line these strips up and put them under my needle and go pedal to the floor, it is very, very easy as I am piecing this to tug on one strip or the other, which means that by the time I get to the end, there's a pretty high likelihood that these strips that started as the same width might not line up anymore. And then the temptation is even bigger to try to pull on one or ease the other in order to make them line up. When fabric gets stretched like that as it's being sewn, when the seam relaxes on the other side of the machine, everything is going to scrunch up just a little. So instead of laying really flat, it's going to have a little wave to it. And that's going to show up later as the strip set grows so that it doesn't lay flat anymore. It'll have those little ripples. So the first thing we want to do for accurate piecing here is we are going to pin these fabrics. Now, I am no huge fan of pinning. This is not my favorite activity, but it makes a big difference. So I'm going to drop a pin at one end, and I'm going to go all the way to the other end of my strip set. And I know these guys are the same width, so I'm going to place a pin there. Okay, and then notice I'm trying not to tug on the fabrics. I'm going to let gravity help me. And all I'm going to do is line up the edges. And then I'm going to go back and forth, and I'm going to do a couple of pins here. And I'm going to come to this end. Notice, again, I'm not tugging, I'm not manipulating, I'm just kind of gently bringing those edges together. And I'm going to go back and forth until I have done this whole strip set. This takes a little extra time right at this point in our procedure, but it's going to save us a lot of effort later. And as you can see, these are lining up quite nicely. They're going to come together, and I think they're going to be pretty darn perfect. Excellent. Then, when I go to piece these strips, it will be much easier to make sure that they stay lined up and that I'm not tugging on them as we go. Now, before we do that, I am just going to very quickly pin this other strip as well. Now that both of these are pieced, I'm going to take a pencil and I am going to mark a little X in the selvage of each of these. You don't have to mark if you're good at keeping track of this next bit, but what this is going to do is it's going to tell me which end went under the machine first. So I'm going to feed both of these strip sets in going the same way. I'm going to remove my pins as I come to them, and I'm going to sew quickly but not pedal to the metal. Sewing steadily is going to make it easier to not tug on my fabric. Notice that my hand is just down here guiding as we go along. I'm paying attention to my seam allowances, but the edge of my fabric is not moving because I pinned these together. Don't hit your pins. And I can feed that second set under just the same. This is called chain piecing, where I don't even break thread in between the two pieces. We can cut that little connector thread later. Now, as I'm getting down to this part, I can see that these edges are not quite staying lined up. And so you notice I'm gonna get them lined up, but still not pull on the fabric. I just kind of gently nudge this orange up to the edge of the white. Tugging on your fabric might look like dragging like this with your hand. See the stretch in the fabric? It might also look like having one of the fabrics in your hand and pulling on it like this. And you can even see how that begins to bow a little bit. We don't want to do either of those things. We're just going to let the feed dogs pull the fabric. So I've got a very light touch at all times. And then I can cut my thread. Now, this X is important because we fed these through this away. And when I open these strip sets, you can see that I am going to have white, orange, okay? And I need to sew these two sets together. However, if I feed these through the same way, I run the risk of this strip set starting to warp one direction or the other because of the movement. I also don't want to risk it getting like stretched out this way and just pulling down and being distorted long ways. So that X that we marked is going to tell me that I want that to go into the machine at the end this time. So I am going to carefully kind of flip these around because I know that whatever's on my left is what I'm going to feed into the machine first. So I put my X over here on my right. We have not pressed those long seams yet. We can press all at one time. That's going to be fine. But I'm going to follow the same procedure for pinning this seam and then feed it through the machine the opposite direction. Otherwise, other than turning around and sewing the other direction, everything else I'm doing for this seam is the same. An important note right here, you may have noticed my folds don't perfectly line up. That's because bolts are not always, like the fabric on the bolt is not always folded directly at the center. So the more important thing is that I've made sure that my ends line up and that these folds, there's no like buckling, bowing, extra fabric, anything like that. Everything fits together really nicely. All right, so one more check. My X is at that end, so we're gonna make sure it goes in last. And we're gonna sew this final seam of this strip set. And just like we predicted, the X is right here at the end, which means we successfully reversed the direction of these strip sets as they went through the machine. So what we did at the piecing step to make sure that our strips don't get warped is we very carefully pinned to prevent any kind of stretching. And then we alternated the sewing direction so that if the machine is doing any pulling on the fabric, that gets balanced out. So this should be a nice, beautiful square strip set as we head over to press it. As we press this, we're going to talk about a couple more ways to make sure this stays square and unworked. As we've been preparing our strip set, we have taken great care to make sure that it stays as straight and unwarped as possible. We want to make sure that we carry that same care into the final step of pressing. Now, I'll be the first to admit, there's a past version of me that would have opened up a strip set like this, grabbed this iron, and just gone for it. And let me tell you, on the back, those seams are going to be twisty, this fabric is going to get warped, and then when I go to do the next step of my quilt pattern, I'm going to wonder what happened to my fabric. So instead, we want to go step by step, seam by seam. Remember, When the fibers of your fabric are warm, that is when they're the most pliable and the most flexible. In some ways, that's really good. That's what allows us to get a really flat seam. But we also want to be careful not to misguide the fabric so that it takes a shape we don't want it to take. All right? So we're going to go seam by seam. So I'm going to flip this first strip over, and I'm going to take my iron, and I am just going to move down and kind of warm up these fibers a little bit. That's going to allow me to begin to manipulate them. And before I actually take the heat of the iron, I'm going to go by hand and coax this seam over. We are going to press all of our seams that way so that all of the seam allowances on the back side are going to face towards y'all. Then the strip set that this is going to get pieced with, I'll press the opposite, right? I'll press them all this away so they nest together when I go to piece them. So by doing this first step by hand, this is a little bit of finger pressing, I can guide that seam so I know that seam allowance is going the right direction. And then I can come along and begin to press. Now notice, I of course am moving down the fabric, but I am not dragging the fabric with me. That's really important. I'm giving it a slight push away from the fold because I want to make sure there's not any extra fabric hiding in there. Because the worst is when you've got that little sneaky few threads that sticks in your seam. We don't want that. We're going to get rid of this little wrinkle. There we go. And then I can actually take my clapper and I'm going to slurp some of that heat back out. And that looks really great. Now this fabric is still warm. And you know what? We'll starch at the end. We'll do all the starching at one time. So now I've taken a lot of the heat back out so that it's going to begin to cool and hold that shape, and we'll start working on the next one. So I'm going to fold down to that next seam, and you can see from the back, look how pretty and flat that first seam looks. And we're going to repeat that exact same process. So I am moving my iron down, but I am not dragging it on the fabric. I've got a little lift each time. And same thing, I'm just going to scooch my hands under here and guide that seam allowance over. And if I'm unsure, I will reach underneath and guide that seam allowance the direction I want it to go. And we want to do this by hand rather than manipulating with the iron because the heat of the iron will make the fabric distort more, okay? And then same thing, little push away to make sure that the seam is flat and there's no fabric hiding in there. But then a little lift as we scooch to the left so we're not dragging the fibers. That looks real nice. Let's hit this little wrinkle. And then I can come along with my flapper again. Make sure we're pressing. And 2 out of 3 are done. Now this last one, it's very tempting to flip it this way and work here so you don't have to deal with the bulk of all this fabric, but then our seam's gonna be going the other direction. And we don't want that. So lift this whole thing up and over. And repeat that process one more time. Warm up that fabric. Lip the strip set. Gentle push away to make sure there's no fabric hiding in the seam, but lift the fabric before you move it to the, or lift the iron before you move it to the left so that you're not dragging. Let's get these folds flat while we're at it. Gorgeous. Now at this point, I'm going to pull the whole strip set back up here. And I mean, I can see that it's laying nice and straight. Very, very good shape. And we're going to do one final step. We're going to do it front and back, okay? Now, if you have a very dark fabric, you may not want to starch the front because sometimes starch can flake. But on these, I'm gonna starch it front and back. I'm gonna very lightly pass this iron over. Do not press down hard as you're doing this. We've worked hard not to have any distortion thus far. We don't wanna create it now, okay? We're just gently warming these fibers. And I like a good heavy starch, okay? Of course, then my starch is clogged. There we go. All right, so give her a good mist. Mine is a little spluttery. Ideally, you won't get the drippies that I'm getting, but clearly I need to clean that nozzle a little better. And we're gonna let this set for just a second. Give it a second to settle into the warm fibers of that fabric. And then very gently pass that iron over again. Now this is important because you'll notice I'm moving the iron back and forth, but I'm not pressing down hard. I just want to help that starch absorb. I'm not changing the shape of the fabric at all. You don't want to be yanking and dragging, right? All right, and then we're gonna flip and we're gonna do the back as well. And you can get as crispy with this as you want. But I like to give this at least, there we go. I like to give this a good starching because when we go to cut in a second, I want to make sure these fibers are going to be a little more stable. Okay, so we've let it set. And I soaked that pretty good, so I'm going to be extra careful with how I'm manipulating this iron on this bit. Beautiful. If you can, at this step, the last thing I would recommend with pressing is let your strip set cool flat. Okay, let it cool either on your ironing board or move it over to a table so that those seams can set fully and it will make it more stable to then take over to your cutting table. Speaking of, I will see you over at the cutting table because I'm going to show you what this next step looks like and why all of this mattered. Finally, the whole point. The whole idea behind strip piecing is to be able to get checkerboard effects, 9 patches, etc., without having to mess with individual squares. So once we've pieced all of our strips together and we've been careful with our cutting, careful with the piecing, and careful with the pressing, we can lay this strip set out on our cutting mat and see the results of our hard work. Now I can see that everything we did together worked because this is lining up almost perfectly on my mat. It has stayed so square and so crispy, and I can take my stripology ruler and be ready to cut my next strips. Now, as you can see very quickly, this is gonna be wider than my stripology. No worries, we're gonna just fold it in half on that seam. Very carefully, just like we've been doing, that we want to just kind of flip things up and let them lay where they lay. We're going to lay our stripology down and we're ready to subcut these sets. Now, when I do this, I'm going to start by cutting at 0, and I'm going to cut down at the necessary intervals. And I'm going to just cut 2 for the moment. But you can see what this allowed me to do of being able to make more than one cut without moving the ruler or the fabric. So then when I open this strip set back up, I've got these gorgeous, crispy sets that are ready to be alternated with other sets in order to make those designs without ever having to deal with those fiddly little squares. Again, my name is Holly, a Knight of String and Story. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video today. If you haven't already, give this video a like and give my channel a follow. And be sure to check out the caption for more resources and more ways that you can stay connected and find more helpful videos to guide you to quote with confidence.